Hi everyone, I'm Jacob Lackner, and it's Thursday, so that means it's time for another history video. This time around I'm answering a question that I'm often asked, both here on YouTube and in the classroom. Did medieval Christians ever convert to Judaism? The answer to this is yes, but not very often. It was incredibly difficult for Christians to cross over to Judaism and remain in Europe, as anyone who was once a Christian would be considered a heretic if they converted. This wasn't a problem for people who were born Jewish, but if you were a Christian who converted to Judaism in the Middle Ages, especially by the later Middle Ages, you were risking imprisonment and even potentially execution if you refused to give up your new faith. And if inquisitions were active in your area, this also meant you could be brought in front of them for questioning. Now, in another video, I mentioned the Inquisition in the Middle Ages mostly avoided executing or torturing people, but those things did happen sometimes, and imprisonment until you agreed to return to Christianity is still a pretty harsh punishment. To explore these issues, we're going to take a look at 4 medieval Christians who converted to Judaism, and I'm going to use those as case studies to discuss the challenges of conversion, as well as the various things that motivated medieval Christians to convert in the first place. These are, of course, not all of the Christians who converted to Judaism in the Middle Ages, but they're some of the most well-documented cases we have, and they're pretty fascinating. We're going to look at these 4 converts chronologically, and we're going to start with a 9th century Frankish cleric named Boto. Boto's case is very well documented, and he's the first example we have of a Christian converting to Judaism in the Middle Ages. So, Bodo was a palace deacon for Louis the Pious, the son of Charlemagne, who inherited all of his father's power, titles, and lands, which included a massive empire that embraced much of Western Europe. In short, Bodo worked for the most powerful man in all of medieval Europe, and a man who was renowned for his piety, so his post was a pretty important one. After spending a few years in this capacity, Bodo received word that he should travel to Rome. However, after announcing his intention to go, he and his entourage diverted from their original itinerary, and instead, Bodo went to Muslim Spain, and there he converted to Judaism, and he changed his name to Eleazar. The changing of one's name was a common practice when it came to conversion. A famous example would be the biblical Saul of Tarsus, ceasing the use of that name, Shaul, and going by Paul after he converted to Christianity. This is why, typically, when you see this guy's name, you see a hyphenated name, Bodo-Eleazar, because they were both his name at different points in his life. We'll continue to see more name changing as we move through this video. In addition to changing his name and religion, Bodo, now Eleazar, also moved to Zaragoza, and not long after got married and started a family. Anyway, what exactly happened here? Why did Bodo go from being a deacon to a pious and powerful emperor to being a Jew who lives in Muslim Spain? Well, the good news for us is that Bodo didn't fade into obscurity after his conversion. He became a zealous defender of Judaism who wrote a lot. Most of what we know about Bodo-Eleazar's post-conversion life comes from a debate that he entered into with the prominent Spanish Christian cleric, Paulus Alvarez. Alvarez also happened to be a convert. He was someone who was born a Jew who had converted to Christianity. In other words, the two men had taken the opposite journey from one another, and as a result, they began a long-standing discussion through letters, with each of them trying to get the other to return to his original faith. Unfortunately for us, somewhere along the line, Bodo-Eleazar's actual writings were destroyed. They were literally ripped out of the manuscript that contained them at one point, probably because people were offended by some of what he wrote, but we don't know for sure. Luckily, Paulus Alvarez's responses to Bodo-Eleazar did survive, and based on what he wrote, we can reconstruct the content of many of Bodo-Eleazar's letters. Norman Golb has written the most complete reconstruction of these letters, and most of what I'm reporting here is his argument about what convinced him to convert. If you're interested in reading more about that, there should be a link to his article in the description. So it looks like that Eleazar argued against the lifestyle of Christian clerics, in particular their focus on a celibate life, especially because Eleazar says that most who take those oaths of celibacy violate them anyway. He uses his own life as evidence, noting that even though he was a deacon, he had many romantic liaisons with women while he worked in the palace of Louis the Pious. Now, as a deacon, he didn't have to take an oath of celibacy, but it is likely that the potential for that very oath led Bodo to become Eleazar. Remember, before he converted, he was supposed to go to Rome for some unknown reason. It seems very likely that given his age and prominent place in society, he was probably going to be elevated to the status of priest or even bishop by the Pope in person. If this had happened, he would have had to take an oath of celibacy. One can easily imagine Bodo basically having a panic attack on his way to Rome when he realized he didn't want to pursue a life without a family. Now, again, this is all Norman Golb's argument for what happened. We don't have the evidence to say this is unequivocally what led to his conversion, but I think it's pretty reasonable to deduce that this is what went down, given how he discusses his dalliances in Louis's court and the fact that he very quickly got married and had children after his conversion. So the next question you might have is, why would he convert instead of just deciding to live a secular life in the Christian world? Well, given that he would go on to be a prominent Jewish theologian, it's also quite likely that he enjoyed his religious vocation, aside from the whole celibacy part, and in Judaism, the idea of celibacy is pretty strange. Jews are supposed to get married and have children. One is pious for doing so, while the church sees celibacy as the ultimate form of piety. Getting married and having children is important too, but it's not quite as good as being celibate. By converting, Bodo was able to obtain both things he wanted, a religious vocation and a family. Obviously enough, it's also likely that he agreed theologically with various aspects of Judaism, but it seems likely that a personal crisis about celibacy was the catalyst that led him to head to Spain to convert in the first place. So Bodo-Eleazar gives us an example of two different things: a Christian cleric who converted to Judaism and someone who converted as a result of theological as well as personal reasons. Those are all things we're going to see with our next three converts too. In fact, as we'll see, most of the well-documented cases of Jewish conversion to Christianity involve clerics, people who are part of the church. Alright, let's move forward in time now to the early 11th century to the next well-documented case of a Jewish convert to Christianity, a man named Vekalin. Vekalin, like Bodo, was a cleric on the court of a prominent noble, in this case the Duke of Carinthia, who ruled a province in what is today southern Austria. The only source we have that discusses this man comes from Albert of Metz, a monk and chronicler. Medieval chroniclers tended to go year by year and list various notable things that happened in a given year, whether they're good or bad, and his entry for the year 1005 is the one that is particularly interesting for us. Albert makes it clear that 1005 was a bad year, and when he lists the things that made that year so awful, he mentions things like famine and death, but also the conversion to Judaism of a cleric named Vekalin. Let's look at the first part of that entry. Albert writes, regarding the cleric who became a Jew in 1005, the apostate Vekalin was led astray by a diabolical illusion, and he embraced the errors of the Jews. He said false things about Christianity, so Emperor Henry sent a cleric to refute him and persuade him to return to the faith. So this man apparently converted because he began to believe in Judaism. That's the main reason listed here, and luckily this isn't all we have to go on, because unlike what we have for Bodo-Eleazar, where we kind of have to come up with a theory, Albert recorded the argument that occurred between the emperor's court cleric and Vekalin, so we have a relatively direct account of what made Vekalin convert. Let's take a look at those statements. Albert writes, in his blasphemous statements, Vekalin wrote the following. In the book of the prophet Malachi, God says, for I am God and I am unchanging, so the incarnation of God as an infant is a lie. His next point is, God said to Moses, no man can see me and live. Thus, the attestations of the saints are all lies. And his third and final point is that David said, God fed the men who feared him, keeping his covenant forever. He has given our people the lands of the heathen. Perpetual time shall leave this unchanged. So he has brought our people to deliverance. Thus, God made his covenant with the Jews and with no other people. So in short, it seems that Vekalin's conversion is the result of personal study of the Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament. He seems to have encountered three passages in particular that concern him and seem to contradict Christianity. In particular, he's doubting three things. First, he no longer believes Jesus to be part of a Trinity, because for him, that contradicts the idea of an eternal and unchanging God. Second, he thinks saints and other mystics who claim to have seen God are liars, because God himself told Moses that no man could see him and live. Third, he points out that the Bible says God made a covenant with Israel that would last forever, thus Christianity is not the religion of God, Judaism is. That last point is likely the one that ultimately led to Vekalin's conversion. So one can easily see why these ideas got Vekalin into trouble, but they do show us something important here. Vekalin has genuine theological disagreements with Christianity that led to his conversion, and like Bodo-Eleazar, he is likely someone that studied for a long time, leading to his conversion since he was a court cleric. His criticism of saints is particularly interesting, as the 11th century was really a time where the veneration of saints began to accelerate and mysticism was becoming increasingly common, so he may have been able to detect a change going on within the church and it was a change he didn't like. In short, it seems that Judaism's ideas about God were much closer to the way Vekalin felt about religion. In a lot of ways, Vekalin is kind of the opposite of Bodo-Eleazar in the sense of what documentation we have. With Bodo-Eleazar, we know a lot of what he was up to after he converted. With Vekalin, we know a lot about his beliefs, but he kind of disappears after that. We don't really know what happened to him in the long run. It's fairly likely that he left Christendom and headed somewhere where his conversion could be undertaken more safely, like the Islamic world. If he didn't, there's a reasonable chance that he was either imprisoned or killed, and the latter might be more likely, since he apparently took time to debate with people while still in Christian Europe, instead of just getting out of there to convert. Let's move now to the case of a 12th century convert, a man known in Judaism as Obadiah the proselyte. Of the 4 converts I'm covering in this video, Obadiah is likely the one who made the greatest lasting contributions to Judaism. He was a Norman Italian noble, born with the name Johann in southern Italy. He became a priest and served in that role for about a decade before ultimately converting to Judaism in 1102. He chose the name Obadiah because the biblical Obadiah was thought to be a convert. His conversion was really important in the history of Jewish music because he brought his knowledge of Gregorian musical notation, which Christians used, with him when he converted. This was a much better way of documenting music than the way Jews were doing it at the time. Using Gregorian notation makes it a lot more precise and easier to reproduce music. He apparently taught this method to others as it began to be the way that Jews recorded their music, starting with Obadiah. We even have some manuscripts that contain liturgical music written in Obadiah's own hand. So what led this priest to convert to Judaism? Luckily, we know a considerable amount about Obadiah, both before his conversion and after. He recorded a memoir in Hebrew, and while not all of it has survived, enough of it has survived for us to learn directly why he converted. Obadiah says that his doubts in Christianity really came to the fore in 1096 when he was in the Rhineland of Germany. Apparently, Obadiah witnessed one of the massacres that occurred there. As I've discussed in other videos, after the call for the First Crusade in 1095, religious zeal was stirred up in some, and even though the church didn't direct them to, some Christians felt that killing Jews at home was just as important as going to the Holy Land and fighting Muslims. Thousands of Jews were killed by roaming bands of crusaders in 1096, and apparently Obadiah witnessed one of these massacres. And this was apparently the moment when he began to doubt his faith in Christianity. Then in 1102, he had a dream that convinced him to fully convert. Unfortunately, we don't know what that dream was, as it hasn't survived. He moved to Baghdad and converted there and moved throughout the Islamic world for the rest of his life, spending the most time in Egypt. Like Vekalin and Bodo, Obadiah is another Christian cleric who chose to convert, and like Bodo, he chose to relocate to the Islamic world so that he could live his life as a Jew without fear of death. The final convert I want to look at comes from 13th century England, and most of what we know about him comes from the records of the Oxford Church Council, which was held in 1222. The council was called for by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. Its stated purpose was to make various reforms to canon law and doctrine according to the canons of the Fourth Lateran Council, which was an international church council that was held in 1215. That council did many things, such as making transubstantiation church doctrine, and as we saw in another video, concluding that Christians should not eat barnacle geese during the Lenten season. But what matters for us was a new requirement that Jews now had to wear identifying clothing, and the reason for this was a serious concern that Jews and Christians would enter into romantic relationships with one another. The idea was, if the Jew was wearing identifying clothing, the Christian would know that person was off limits. The Council of Oxford ordered that Jews should be wearing this identifying clothing. It was during the discussion of this canon in particular that it came to the attention of Langton and others that there was a Jew living in Oxford who had once been a Christian. Apparently, he was married to a Jewish woman and had children. He had once been a university student at Oxford who studied Hebrew. He had once been known as Robert but changed his name to Haggai upon his conversion. It's quite interesting that this man's former status as a Jew was apparently common knowledge, but before the Council of Oxford, he was apparently just left alone to live his life as a Jew. It is unclear exactly how long before the council he converted. We've already seen that people like Bodo-Eleazar and Obadiah had to flee their homes to convert, but apparently that wasn't the case for Haggai. It's unclear how long ago he converted, but he is noted as having multiple children, so it had to have been around 3 years or more. Unfortunately for him, the Fourth Lateran Council and the subsequent 1222 Council of Oxford brought about a change in how he was treated. In addition to the requirement to wear identifying clothing, the church also established at the council that baptism left an indelible mark on the soul of a Christian, and this meant that conversion to another religion made a Christian a heretic. And that's a big deal. Before the Fourth Lateran Council, it isn't exactly clear what people should do with Christians who converted to Judaism. Now it has become very clear. Treat them as heretics, which means the Inquisition can get involved, they can be questioned, they can be executed, imprisoned, and so forth. So all of that's really bad news, obviously, for Haggai. Once Langton heard about him, he had him brought in front of the council to be questioned. During the questioning, Haggai revealed that he had converted initially because he fell in love with a Jewish woman, but he also staunchly stated that he was now a firm believer in Judaism. According to the documents recorded by the council, he specifically stated, quote, "I renounce your newfangled laws and the sayings of Jesus, who is a false prophet," end quote. He apparently also slandered Mary, how exactly isn't recorded, indicating that it was probably particularly offensive to those in attendance. Haggai was informed that if he refused to recant his beliefs, he would be executed as a heretic. He refused to recant, and he was ultimately executed by the council. The English Jewish community elevated him to the status of a martyr, and today there's actually a plaque commemorating the event on what is left of the abbey where he was executed. So, those are the 4 case studies of conversion that I wanted to talk about. While all of them did convert, at least in part, for theological reasons, there were also some different additional motivating factors for each of these men. For Bodo, he likely decided to become Eleazar out of a desire to avoid a celibate life. Vekalin chose to convert because he disagreed with the direction the church was going in, and he saw Judaism as a better alternative. Obadiah converted in part because he was appalled at the persecution of Jews, and Haggai became a Jew because he fell in love with a Jewish woman. These varying motivations are quite reflective of other Christian converts to Judaism in the Middle Ages, and really reflective of the reasons that people changed their religion throughout all of history. While these men had different motivations to convert, they did all have something in common. They were all well-educated clerics whose studies brought them into contact with Judaism in one way or another. Even Haggai, whose at least initial reasons for conversion seemed to be more personal than the other 3 men, it is important to note that he was a student of Hebrew, which very likely influenced him. The other thing we learned from these men is that it was nearly impossible to be a Christian convert to Judaism and stay living in Christian Europe. We know for sure that Eleazar and Obadiah moved into territory under Islamic rule, and we know that ultimately Haggai was executed for his conversion, which is exactly the kind of thing that Eleazar and Obadiah were fearful of. We aren't sure of Vekalin's fate, but the complete silence about him following his conversion either means he disappeared, likely into the Islamic world, or he was executed or imprisoned. It is worth noting that while conversions to Judaism from Christianity certainly were not commonplace, they probably were more common than some of the sparse sources we have indicate. It isn't likely every single convert ever was recorded, and while these men indicate that educated clerics were often converts, it may just be that they're the ones we know the most about because of their position within society. Others converted too, but probably did so more quietly than the people I discussed in this video. Well, that does it for this week's video. Next week I'll be doing another top 10. This time I'll be looking at military history and in particular the 10 most important battles of the Crusade. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the videos I've already done, you should see some of them on your screen now. Thanks for watching.